and in others was like every other man during his time. So the fact that Douglas referred to the fact that he had a bride that was underage is something which we can now look back on and say that was an awful practice. But just as we look back on many things that Romans did and say that was an awful practice, just as we look back on many things that Martin Luther did and said that was an awful practice. But we don't judge these men by the standards that we have today.
Let's bring in Douglas Murray.
No, we do, and we should. We should, Majid. And may I say, it's a bit too cutesy to compare a man who raped a 9-year-old girl repeatedly with men being, the wife's a bit of the master of the household and so on. A bit too cutesy and a bit too much avoiding the issue, which is this. That this is actually a very real concern, which doesn't just apply in mid-7th century Arabia, but today, here and now, in Britain, in my own country. We now have, thanks to an arbitration act put into a law in the 1990s, whereby people can have civil disputes arbitrated under laws that they can decide on, that we now have Sharia courts in Great Britain. And the Sharia courts that in Great Britain are operated by people who are actually clerics. They are religious authorities. There's one at the moment, Siddiqui in Leicestershire. Now this man runs a set of Sharia courts. A couple of years ago, it turned out that we found out a little bit about the sort of thing he was deciding. And sadly, again, it's not reformist stuff, because when you go back to the Sharia, people take the lessons from it and they make judgments like the following. 6 women who had gone to the Sharia courts because they were being physically abused by their husbands. They were persuaded to drop the cases because this should be a matter between a Muslim woman and her Muslim husband and the Sharia court. This should not be a matter for the police in Great Britain in 2008. That stinks. What's more, there was in another case, a local Muslim man died. His will was arbitrated by Sharia because that was what happens now in 21st century Britain. And the arbitration of this man's will gave half the inheritance to the daughters as to the sons of the man, because that's what you have in the Quran.
But
so
Douglas,
it's all very well to say
Majid just
that
actually said that he agrees with you that this stuff needs to change.
But the point is that when you look at the courts that are doing this, when you look at the religious authorities, when you look at the clerics, the judgments they're making, those are the kinds of judgments. I wish that Majid would get some clerics on his side who could set up rival Sharia courts that didn't decide that women were second-class citizens. But sadly, at the moment, that is the case.
So, Douglas, actually, the irony was, that, as you know well, that the person who came out most publicly in support of those regrettable Sharia courts in the UK was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And we at Quilliam opposed their creation. And actually, many Muslims in Britain do oppose their creation because it raises the question. Islam has never had a clergy. It's never had a pope. And so when you try and institute Sharia courts as law, the question arises, whose Sharia do you follow? Now, that's an internal debate that's going on and raging, and that I'm part of in Pakistan, for example, because there isn't one version of Sharia, and everything you've referred to is bad. We condemn these practices, but the fact is we can't be reductionist, essentialist, simplistic, lack nuance and call it Sharia, because there isn't one Sharia, as you well know, just as there isn't one reading of Shakespeare.
All right, I want to move on, and when we come back, we're going to take questions from the audience. All right, so we're going to go to questions from the audience now, and if you raise your hand, what I'll do is take a cluster of questions and then start presenting them to the panel. And I just want to remind you, if you'll get a microphone, please stand up and hold it about 2 fists away from your mouth so that the radio can pick you up. And please keep it as terse as possible right against the wall there. And blue shirt here. And eyeglasses and green. All right. So you get 30 seconds to ask your question. It makes me nervous that you've got something written down on a piece of paper.
Under 30 seconds, I promise.
All right, go ahead.
Zeba, in your opening remarks, you said that Islamic terrorists are motivated by politics, not religion. Considering that Islamic terrorists make up the majority of suicide terrorists in the world today, what's happening to Muslims politically that isn't happening to any other major religious group that can account for the disproportionate amount of terrorism coming out of the Islamic world?
Bingo. That was a good question. That is the model.
Yeah, that was a great question.
Your number, I'm going to take the questions, and then number 2. Yeah. Yes, I'm ready for you, sir. Oh, I'm sorry, there, with the microphone. Yes, you, sir.
My question was relatively similar, but I'll make it. This has to do with the Muslim community's reaction to suicide bombings. you stated there's 1.5 billion Muslims, and yet the silence of this community on suicide bombings, the justification, the rationalization, the wiggles from the community, from the religious community, from the Muslim states, Arab states and Muslim states, is something that in the West we find puzzling. How would the panelists react to that?
Thank you. And third question?
I hope this isn't too naive, but if Islam is not a religion of peace, is it possible for it to become one?
Well, I think that's a great question, actually. I was trying to get at that with the reform issue, but I just think you put it far more eloquently. So I'm going to take all those questions because I thought they were all good. Seba, do you want to take the response to the first one? Basically, why the preponderance of terrorism, the questioner is saying, is committed by Muslim extremists. Why are we not seeing that happening from other groups?
So what I can't say is, I know that it's a complicated question. And so you have history involved, you have different factors that contribute to the answer. What I can say for sure, just based on looking at the studies that come out, is that the level of religiosity, the level of piety of violence, of terrorists, compared to mainstream Muslims, is virtually, there's no difference. So it's literally, when you ask them how practicing they are, how often do they attend services, things like that, it's literally the same. So that can't be the distinguishing factor. But what we do know, as I mentioned earlier, is when you ask them, the one big difference is when you ask them what they fear the most. And they say their perceived idea of Western domination, which is very similar to what we hear from our opposition, a perceived fear of Islamic domination. And so when you compare that to the mainstream, who just want to get a job.
Would the other side like to respond to that question as well? Or to the answer that you heard? And if not, we'll move on.
Well, I'll move on.
Okay.
Can I just add something?
Sure. No.
Sorry. There's also, I think, just to add something, that the preponderance has a lot to do with the spread of a certain ideology that I refer to as Islamism that has arisen in the post-colonial context and that was exported to the Middle East through geopolitics. Now, what happened was that there was a need for a cause to resist against colonialism. And Britain was a secular liberal country. The cause, the ideology that the Arabs adopted who were resisting, initially it was Arab socialism, Baathism, and that morphed into Islamism, which owes much of its origins to Arab socialism. And so what we find is that the spread of this ideology, pretty much like how post-World War I Europe, with the identity crisis that emerged after the Weimar Republic, led to the growth of fascism in Europe, with fascism in Italy, Nazism in Germany, and totalitarian Stalinism in the USSR, we see the same thing playing out post-empire in the Middle East. So what it's related to is the spread of this ideology that has hijacked the minds of many young Muslims. And yes, Muslims need to do more to challenge this ideology. We are trying to convince them of that, but this is a very modern phenomenon. I remind you, Khomeini is a modern phenomenon, and he created a revolution where he flipped Shiite theology on its head, as are the others. Bin Laden, Sayyid Qutb, they are all modern phenomena.
Okay, Majid, you have awakened the other side on this topic.
Yes, because
should have kept my mouth shut.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Majid, what you're saying is Islamism is invented by the British. Islamism has nothing to do with Islam. External, external, external. Those poor Muslims who are seduced with the Quran and the activities of Muhammad, their own culture, their own convictions, their own history, they have, they are only the victims. Ideas inspire, ideas unite, ideas people bring together. And Muhammad succeeded first and foremost in uniting a disparate Bedouin, desert Arab group of people. And they unified and they conquered. And when it worked, it was all Islam. When Muslims were successful, when they conquered lands, it was all great, it was Islam. Now that we're faced with this problem, it's Islamism, and it was created by the British Empire.
Well,
I just want the other side. I don't think we will ever be able to address this issue if we systematically refuse to acknowledge, and that is what that side of the panel is doing. So let me finish it. Yeah. To systematically refuse to acknowledge the flaws of Islam. I grew up as a Muslim. I left Islam. Why did I do it? Because I couldn't hide away from the blemishes. And I believe we can improve that. I can believe we can inspire young Muslims and the youth bulge. There are millions and millions of young Muslim men under the age of 30. That in itself is a source of violence without it being Muslim. We can inspire them if we can only acknowledge that part of the problem is us, not just the British Empire.
I'm not saying it's the fault of the British. If I was going to say that, I would have joined a very successful British law firm.
What has Islamism got to do with Islam?
I'm saying to you, I would have been a lawyer and I would have got on with my life. I'm taking responsibility for that, and I'm trying to get others to take responsibility for the growth of Islamism within Muslim minds and challenge that. So no one's blaming the British and no one's claiming
the second question was on the topic of, and you almost got to it in your last answer, Majid, but the second question was, where is the clear-cut, broad condemnation of terrorism from Muslim leaders?
Yeah, so there have been many such fatwas or pronouncements against suicide bombings. In many cases, they're not reported. There does need to be more. However, I'll give you an example of why in some cases there aren't more. Now, recently we at Quilliam publicized a fatwa by Dr. Tahir al-Qadri against terrorism, a no ifs, no buts condemnation of suicide bombing and terrorism that Douglas, always a pleasure to speak with you on the panel, supported. And was quoted in the press as supporting Dr. Tahir al-Qadri's fatwa against terrorism. Now, the reason why there aren't many more such examples, though there are quite a few, is because prior to Dr. Tahir al-Qadri issuing this fatwa, his colleague, who was also from the same way of thinking, was assassinated in Pakistan, was killed by a suicide bomber in a mosque where all the other congregants who were praying were also blown to smithereens because he had the guts to simply give a sermon in that mosque condemning suicide bombings. And so this is why many people are scared, because it takes guts, I tell you, to go into Pakistan and try and challenge these extremists. That's a country that doesn't have much rule of law. It's a country that's struggling against the so-called Pakistani Taliban from taking over a third of their country. And they're fighting that fight on the front lines. And there are those who are brave enough just to give a speech to condemn terrorism, and they're blown to smithereens in their mosque while praying. And surely they're religious people. They were praying in a mosque, Douglas. You did support that fatwa, though, didn't you?
I did. It's the only time I've ever done a book review of a fatwa. I'm sorry to say this, Majid, you seem to have just proved our point.
Yes.
Please explain.
Is it? I mean, I'm very grateful. It's a very important and very interesting question, why more people don't stand up. I much admire al-Qadri for that fatwa, as I have other people who have stood up. But the number of times I've spoken to folks behind closed doors and so on, and you say, why aren't you saying anything? They say, because if I do speak up, I'll be killed. Well, I address you again, ladies and gentlemen, to the motion.
No, but hold on. Sorry. Right, hang on. How on earth does fear of being killed in Pakistan by a minority faction of extremists prove Islam is not a religion of peace?
Let me put it this way.
Douglas, No, sorry, I've got to... Because really, what you've just said is really quite absurd, and I've got to clarify. It takes one person to kill all of us here. One person in a suicide bombing. Now, if we were scared of saying what we're saying now because of that one person, it doesn't mean all of us love war and hate peace in any way whatsoever. It means we all fear that one person who could walk through that door with a suicide bomb jacket strapped to his chest.
If we were discussing Quakerism here tonight, does anyone think that when a Quaker said, I'm quite fearful about speaking up against certain things, come on, this only happens with Islam. There is no other major faith in the world today where it is the case that people are fearful of addressing religion because they're afraid they'll be killed. It's only Islam, and we're saying there's a reason.
I'm afraid of being killed by apostates. Yes, and many of you who came here tonight came under unusual circumstances. I'm not in government. I'm not a powerful person. I'm a citizen.
Can you explain what you mean by unusual circumstances?
Unusual circumstances, you went through metal detectors to come to a debate in New York. I mean, talk about Quakerism.
That's because it takes one person to get through those metal detectors and blow us up. It doesn't mean the majority of people are terrorists.
Let me finish. The people that I am protected against, and you as an audience too, the individual who wants to kill me because I'm an apostate of Islam is inspired to do that from the scripture of Islam, the example of the Prophet Muhammad, the clergy that preached to him, and the reward he will get in the hereafter that is promised in the Quran. All of that is Islamic. The sooner you admit that,
I'll tell you what he's inspired
the sooner you admit that, the sooner I can get rid of my bodyguards.
He's inspired. I'll tell you what he's inspired by. Right.
Majid,